At FIE, we're not just
students
and faculty.
We're not only learners
and lecturers.
We are expanding minds,
Expanding futures.
We're redefining the classroom.
We are life-changing.
eye-opening. We are a community
Driven by our values.
That wants you.
you.
Yes, you.
To join.
Hello and welcome to In the Field, a podcast from FIE, where we will be exploring all things study abroad. I'm Dr. Heidi James Dunbar, writer in residence and faculty, and I will be your host. Joining me today is Callum Watts. Callum has worked as a manager and consultant in a range of public and private sector organisations, as well as having a wealth of teaching experience in philosophy and ethics. He has taught philosophy in universities, for non-profit and private sector clients. He has helped start a technology company where he led the consulting team and worked on improving the innovation culture in large organisations. He has also worked in the UK Cabinet Office to develop an innovation strategy for the UK civil service. He's deeply interested in the relationship between individuals and their organisations and the power of leadership to shape their cultures and ways of doing things. So I'm really looking forward to chatting with him. To learn more about our programmes, the courses and our faculty, you can of course head to our website fie.org.uk. Hey, welcome, Callum. Thank you for joining me in the field.
Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. I've just read your incredibly varied and really interesting bio from private sector universities to the government and civil service, which is amazing. Which, for me, I read that and thought that dispels that weary old trope of why are you getting a philosophy degree or an English lit degree? What are you going to do with that? And clearly, you demonstrate that your philosophy degree has been incredibly valuable for you. Can you tell me a little bit more about that and what inspired you to study philosophy at degree?
Yeah, I think I actually started studying philosophy probably for the same reason that lots of people do, which was I was just very interested as a teenager in all these big questions about life. So I think it was, I started studying philosophy because I thought the topic was fascinating. What's right, what's wrong, what's real, what's not. And then I think it turned out that after I graduated, I think being able to ask and attempt to answer complicated questions is actually a very useful skill to train. So although I started completely fascinated by all these issues, I did find that when I left university, they became really useful in a variety of different contexts. So I worked in I helped found a technology startup, which was quite successful. And I worked in government, in the UK Cabinet Office, and in all those cases, I found that asking challenging questions or asking questions that hadn't been asked yet has always been like this very, I guess, productive thing to do in a team, and people appreciate it in the right kind of team. So I suppose for me, that's both the reason why I got into philosophy, was asking those sorts of questions, and also why it ended up being useful for me in my career afterwards.
Yeah. So, you very much then, it seems, have integrated philosophy and ethics into your both personal and professional life.
Yeah, I think about it a lot. I think that's definitely true, and I am interested in like the big picture. So asking questions about what is fair, for example. So when I worked in the private sector, actually, so when I started this technology startup, my initial title was the in-house philosopher, and there was 4 of us. By the end, when there was sort of 30 of us, I had to be something a bit more humdrum. It was like consultancy lead, but definitely I think I was doing the same sorts of things, asking like, why are we doing this? Is this the right thing for us? I know that everyone else does it this way, but maybe we should try something different. So a lot of those sorts of questions. And I think when I went into the cabinet office, I was doing the same sort of thing. So it was a sort of government reform program. And so it was, how should we change the civil service? How should we change government to improve it? And again, I was using those kind of philosophical intuitions, I guess, to ask questions about how government can be different. I guess the one thing I'm always wary of is I think there's famous studies on, are ethics professors more ethical than ordinary people? And I think that sort of the answer is no. They do all the same things as other people. So maybe we're good at asking questions and understanding problems, but we're as flawed as anyone else. I certainly don't think we're more ethical than other people.
So philosophy professors are only human. You heard it here first.
Yeah, exactly.
So what I'm picking up very much from you is this process of questioning. So it's not necessarily offering answers all the time, but it's the process of questioning. Do you feel like perhaps we don't do that enough in both personal and professional lives, or that we sort of get stuck maybe?
Yeah, I think that's I think it's hard to ask difficult questions in our personal and professional lives because it sort of interrupts whatever you're doing. So whether it's in, a job and your boss has asked you to do something, or whether it's in a personal relationship where you feel like something's wrong, but you can't quite put your finger on it. I think asking questions like that always can upset people, can destabilize things. And I definitely think it's challenging. And I think part of the joy of doing philosophy is it's a field where we say, ask difficult, upsetting questions and see what happens as a result. And, if you look at the origins of Western philosophy, at least, it's a sort of a guy called Socrates wandering around Athens asking people problematic questions, which wound people up so much that they end up either exiling or killing him. So I do think that's the whole ethos of the field, I guess, is trying to ask questions that other people aren't asking. And I think philosophy tries to make that easy, but definitely, generally speaking, I think it's a hard thing to do.
Yeah, I think often it's as you say, it's a hard thing to do because often people don't like to be asked those hard questions. So their response is what makes the asking difficult.
Yeah, that's really true, I think. And I mean, so for example, in a philosophy classroom, you try and encourage a sort of almost artificial. So I teach an ethics class, and we'll say, in this space, we're going to examine hot button topics, and we're going to ask difficult questions about them. And we'll do artificial things. So we'll say, like, we'll do sort of devil's advocate, which is to say you'll take on the opposite side of your own argument to try and understand what you might be wrong about. We'll do things like strong manning. So, create the most compelling version of the point you're trying to attack before you attack it. We try and, I guess, take some of the heat out of discussions, which you would see if you were having the same conversation online. And obviously you can manage that to a greater or lesser degree, I think, in a philosophy seminar. I think as soon as you go out into the real world, though, something that becomes much harder. Although I say we question everything in a philosophy seminar, I definitely don't in my ordinary life kind of, constantly try and undermine everyone's deeply held truths and convictions, because I think that's, you have to be a bit judicious about when you ask those questions and outside of the philosophy classroom.
Yeah, I think picking your moment is even actually maybe could be considered part of ethics, couldn't it? Like understanding when someone is in a place to be questioned or has the resources to be questioned is very different to just running amok.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I love how you just brought that in about the teaching and the classes that you're doing here with us at FIE. So can you tell me a little bit more about how you set those up, those sort of almost like case studies, and how you how to do the questioning?
So the class I teach is called Ethical Leadership, which I really like because it already brings in this idea that ethics is something, it's kind of a responsibility. and is also something practical, which I think is helpful. And whenever I teach it, I will bring in my own case studies that I'm interested in at the beginning. So I have a particular interest in politics, so I bring in lots of cases of corrupt or non-corrupt politicians, or difficult sort of trade-offs that sometimes politicians have to make. So, for example, how you should tax things, given the fact that you want more revenue, but also given the fact that affects people's liberty, for example. So, like, I find those kinds of topics interesting. But I think that I also try and encourage students to bring things forward that they're really engaged with. So we've had quite a lot of stuff on social media sort of recently in the last couple of times I've taught it. And that's all sorts of angles. So, for example, from how responsible are content creators for the impact that they actually have on their listeners and followers, would be one issue. We've had issues to do with how much content creators need to be honest, with either what they're selling or like what they actually believe. And so I think that's been really fun, because those are issues which I wouldn't naturally know that much about, because I'm not necessarily on TikTok, and I don't follow sort of big YouTube content creators necessarily, but it's been very fun discovering that stuff with my students and exploring some of those, I think, actually really pressing ethical issues which are ever present now, because they're all in your phone, I guess, and constantly engage with it.
Really important, aren't they? And this is the class that leads, or it's part of our SGLC, the Student Global Leadership Conference, right, where students get to present what they've been studying with you and learning about.
Yeah, and part of what I really love about it is, I think, so I just have this pet theory that actually ethics is done quite badly most of the time. People are very good at being very reactive to things, especially sort of issues. I actually think, in terms of like, do I call my parents enough? Am I nice to strangers? I think people are actually often quite good at that bit of ethics. But as soon as it comes to sort of issue stuff, the hot button topics, people basically end up often believing what they want to believe, and often, can sink to the lowest common denominator in terms of like how the debate goes, which if it's online, is usually quite bad. And what I like to do is encourage students to take these topics that they really care about and then work through them really thoroughly. So they'll take one of these topics that they're interested in, and they'll spend weeks thinking about the case for and against. They'll really dig into the other side of the argument. They'll really examine critically their own assumptions. And then as groups, they'll present back this ethical issue. And I'll present it back at this conference you mentioned, sort of a wider audience, in a really professional way. And I'll have like properly examined this topic. And again, it's all sorts of stuff. It will be issues related to, climate change. We've had presentations on fast fashion. We've had presentations on responsibilities around body image presentation on the internet, all sorts of things. What's nice about it is I hope that if you examine one issue in that kind of depth, it maybe encourages you to do the same with other things, at least, or at least makes you realize you have the option. You don't have to take whatever the latest Twitter take is on some issue. You can actually examine things in a great deal of detail and come to these like really well reflected, well balanced, and well justified ethical perspectives. So hopefully that works a little bit.
So it's providing a model really that could be taken
exactly.
away. And do you find students do often change their minds, or at least sort of come to a more nuanced understanding?
Yeah, I have on quite a lot of issues. I don't think it happens invariably, because obviously people are sometimes right, or believe they're right about something and continue to believe they're right. But I definitely have seen students change their views. I think it's been especially interesting to have dialogues between students from very different parts of the US. I've had students from, sort of urban coastal centres engaging on topics that are very contentious, with students who come from very rural, Midwestern parts of the US. And often those conversations have been the most productive. And because they're happening in a classroom, I don't think they're as het up as they would be if they were happening, online or in a kind of media environment. And I think you've seen students really learn to see the other person's perspective in some of those cases, which I found really interesting.
Yeah, because I think it's less about one's individual self, and so much has become bound up in our identity, as opposed to these are ideas. We're discussing ideas. This isn't ad hominem. This isn't about you personally. These are ideas.
Exactly. Yeah, and because we spend a lot of time together, we also, we realise that we all quite like each other as individuals. So it's much harder to villainize someone if they're sat there right in front of you, and you already know that you like chatting with them and grab a coffee with them, and that you watch the same sports teams. It becomes much harder to be like, oh, well, you're just the enemy. And especially in the context of sort of political polarization that we see today, I think that's really nice.
Yeah. So I understand, I've heard that you've been awarded funding for your PhD, which is a really significant achievement. So congratulations for that. But tell me more about what you're going to be researching.
Well, thanks very much. And yeah, I found out a couple of weeks ago that I've got funding to do research for 3 years on the topic of, so the other course I teach at FIE is around diplomacy. And I had this research project I'd wanted to do for about a year now on the sort of ethics and theory of diplomacy, and I've been looking for somewhere to do it. So I'm starting at King's College in a couple of weeks, actually, to do this research project, looking at what are the ethical principles that underlie diplomatic interaction, because that has not been very well studied in political philosophy, which is my field. People tend to be quite interested in domestic stuff. So like, what should the law be? What is justice? What political system should we have? They're often quite interested in international stuff along the lines of, what aid should wealthy countries, for example, provide to less wealthy countries, but no one's looked at the sort of dialogue between states, for want of a better word, as a space with its own ethical concerns. So how do countries talk to one another, and what rules should govern that conversation? And so that's what my project is looking at.
Because it's very much about, I'm guessing, how we bring global north towards global south, and those inherent privileges, those colonial tropes that we carry around, and the imbalance of power. There's, which epistemologies are we digging into here?
Yeah, totally. And I mean, there's some very interesting issues around so how it can be legitimate as well, because so right now lots of our international institutions, for example, favor global north, or at least globally very wealthy countries. And those are diplomatic institutions, so like the UN Security Council, for example. But the UN Security Council claims to be a rule-creating organization for the whole world. Well, it doesn't claim to be, it is. And it's interesting to ask questions about, well, how can it be legitimate if from a conversation perspective, only 5 states actually have the ability to be full members of it? And I'm really curious about that. I think people have tended to look at that as a practical problem, and I think actually that's an ethical issue. There's a diplomatic system, a diplomatic dialogue happening here, and some voices are excluded from it. In a way which, if we look at, say, UK politics at a domestic level, we understand that that's wrong. You couldn't say, well, only 5 constituencies get to decide everything, and they have mega MPs, and everyone else has pretend MPs. Like that would be very clearly a kind of a massive compromise we wouldn't want. But at the international system, no one seems to, not no one, but like it hasn't been quite examined in the same way. People have talked about it, but I guess the way I want to examine it is from that philosophical ethics.
Brilliant. That sounds really, I bet you're really excited to dig in and just,
Yeah. I mean, it's also early days, so I think it's, I think everything I say has to be taken with a pinch of salt. It may be that in a couple of years it'll be a very different thing that I'm looking at. But yes, I'm really excited.
Many years on from my PhD, I guarantee you it will be that you start here, but that's the beauty of it. You start with this wonderful, exciting idea, and then you work through that, and it becomes, and it develops and evolves and becomes what it was always going to be anyway, which is something really
Yeah,
exciting.
yeah, exactly.
No, that's
Yeah.
wonderful. Congratulations. I would like, if you'd share your city secret, please.
Yes. So my city secret is a bakery in East London called the Dusty Knuckle. It's quite well known, but the reason it might be less well known to our listeners is that it's very much on the other side of London, from where we're all based. And it's a bakery I've been a baker at for 3 years, and we make incredible focaccia. We make really good baguettes and great patisserie. And if they're lucky, I might be there covered in flour at the back trying to make bread.
That's
Yeah.
fantastic. You're a bread maker.
Yeah, it's my secret hobby slash obsession, I guess.
Well, we've blown the secret, but tell me, what do you love about making bread? What does it give for you?
You know what? It's the opposite of my sort of philosophy, researching, teaching job. It's very sensory. Sense is that a word? You're very engaged with the senses, so you're thinking about touch, you're thinking about smell, you're thinking about taste. It's very physical. You have to. It's a surprisingly hard job. If you're making, on a big day, we'll make almost 2 tons of bread. That's hard work. That has to be moved. It has to be folded. It has to be shaped. It has to be baked. It's very demanding physically, and also it's very satisfying. Sort of, you start with flour and water, and you finish with these beautiful loaves. And there's something about that which you don't always get when you're doing philosophy. Sometimes you sort of start with questions and you end with questions, and there's a slight sense of frustration. So it's a very different. I'd say it's a very big contrast to what I do in my other day job. Yeah,
I think it's wonderful. And a brilliant name, Dusty Knuckle. I love that. It's fantastic.
Yeah. Please visit.
I will. I am not one of these people who denies themselves carbs. I love it. I love a good. Brilliant. Thank you so much for joining me, Callum. I've loved chatting with you, and let's chat again soon.
Thanks so much. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much.
If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe or follow us on your podcast app where you can. And there you'll find more episodes introducing our faculty, tips for studying abroad, and more. Thank you so much for listening. I really do hope you enjoyed this podcast. FIE provides life-changing study abroad experiences in the UK, Ireland, and Spain. As a non-profit education organisation, we are passionately invested in making a difference for our students as the future global leaders of tomorrow, and in the field of international education as a whole. The FIE podcast is a creative and academic space for exploring everything, the people, the places and opportunities that make your experience so valuable and exciting.
FIE. We're here to help you
Unlock a wider
brighter future.